Elias' heart had sealed himself in a cocoon of silence for 10 years. His voice as forgotten as the songs his wife, Clara, once hummed while kneading bread in their sunlit kitchen. His farm, tucked in a lonesome valley where the wind carved paths through brittle grass, was both sanctuary and sentence, a place where he could outrun the world, but not the memories of Clara and their daughter, Lily, stolen by a fever that burned through their lives like wildfire. Each morning, he rose before dawn, his boots scuffing the same worn paths, feeding the chickens, mending fences, tending to the lone horse that snorted softly in the stable, its breath the only sound that answered his own. The summer of 1878. Pressed down with a merciless heat, the sun a relentless eye that baked the earth until it cracked like old leather. Elias, his shirt clinging to his sweat-soaked back, was driving a nail into a sagging fence post when a sound shattered the stillness. Voices, fragile yet insistent, weaving through the heavy air like threads of a long-forgotten melody. He froze, hammer poised, his pulse quickening as he squinted toward the dirt trail that snaked from the main road to his gate. 3 figures emerged from the shimmering haze, their shadows stretching long and wavering, trailed by smaller shapes that clung to their skirts like burrs. Women, he realized, and children, their steps faltering under the weight of exhaustion and something heavier, fear, perhaps, or desperation. The sight clawed at the edges of his carefully guarded heart, stirring memories he'd buried deep. Clara's gentle touch on Lily's fevered brow, the way her prayers trembled in the dark, unanswered as their daughter slipped away. Elias's first instinct was to turn back to his work, to let the strangers pass, to keep the world at bay as he had for a decade. But the smallest child, a girl no older than Lily had been, tripped in the dust, her sharp cry slicing through the air like a blade. The lead woman, her face half hidden by a faded bonnet, knelt swiftly, scooping the child into her arms with a tenderness that made Elias's chest ache. Her dress, once a vibrant hue, was now a ghost of itself, patched and grayed by miles of hardship, yet she moved with a purpose that belied her slumped shoulders. The other 2 women flanked her, one clutching a small bundle that might have been all she owned, the other guiding a boy whose wary eyes scanned the unfamiliar land with a vigilance too old for his years. As they drew closer, Elias saw the truth. In their faces, not the aimless wandering of lost travelers, but the resolute flight of those running from something dark. The lead woman raised a hand, her voice steady despite the tremor in it, calling out, "Sir, we mean no harm. We just need a moment of your time." Elias stood rooted, the hammer heavy in his calloused hand, the silence he'd cultivated for years cracking like thin ice under the weight of their presence. The boy, no more than 9, stepped slightly ahead of his mother, his small frame taut with defiance, as if ready to shield her from whatever threat this solitary man might pose. The toddler, now quiet in her mother's arms, clutched a tattered ribbon, her tear-streaked face smudged with the dust of a long journey. Elias's gaze lingered on her, the curve of her cheek so like Lily's that he had to look away, his throat tightening with a grief he thought he'd mastered. The farm, once his fortress, now felt exposed, its boundaries porous under the gaze of these strangers. He wanted to send them away, to retreat to the safety of his solitude, but the woman's eyes met his eyes that held not just exhaustion but a quiet, desperate hope, a plea for something he wasn't sure he could give. She took another step, her voice softer now. "We've been walking since before dawn. We just need a place to rest." The words hung between them, simple yet heavy, and Elias felt the weight of a choice he hadn't made in years. His hand tightened on the hammer, not out of fear, but from the muscle memory of a man who'd spent a decade building walls that were crumbling now, under the weight of a child's cry and a mother's courage. The valley, once a silent witness to his grief, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for him to decide. These women and their children weren't just strangers. They were a mirror, reflecting a life he'd tried to forget, a life where he'd once been a husband, a father, a man who cared. The boy's gaze locked onto Elias, wary but searching, as if sensing the battle raging within the older man. The toddler shifted, her small hand reaching out toward the air, and Elias saw Lily in her gesture and the way her mother held her close. He hadn't chosen this moment, but it had chosen him, and as the women stood at his gate, their shadows pooling like spilled ink Elias' heart realized that the solitude he'd clung to was no longer a shield, it was a chain. Amelia's voice trembled with a quiet strength as she stood at Elias' heart's gate. Her toddler daughter, Lila, nestled against her shoulder, the child's ragged ribbon fluttering in the hot breeze. The other women, Ruth and Esther, flanked her, their faces etched with the kind of weariness that comes from carrying more than just physical burdens. Elias, still gripping his hammer, felt the weight of their gaze, each pair of eyes a silent question he wasn't ready to answer. The boy at Ruth's side, Jonah, clutched her hand, his knuckles pale, his stare fixed on Elias as if measuring the man's worth. The valley's oppressive heat seemed to press closer, the air thick with dust and unspoken stories. Amelia spoke again, her words deliberate. "We've walked 25 miles from a place that wasn't safe. We don't ask for much, just a night to rest, for the children's sake." Elias's jaw tightened, his mind racing with reasons to turn them away. His solitude was his armor, forged in the ashes of loss, but the sight of Lila's tiny frame, trembling from hunger, snagged at the edges of his resolve. He glanced at the farmhouse behind him, its windows dark, its rooms heavy with the ghosts of Clara and Lily. Letting strangers in meant opening doors he'd nailed shut years ago. Ruth stepped forward, her voice softer but no less firm. "The boarding house we fled, the man there wanted more than we could give. He threatened our children." Her hand rested on Jonah's shoulder, and the boy straightened, as if her touch anchored him against the fear in her words. Esther, clutching a small bundle of cloth, added quietly, "We heard in town you live alone, that you're a good man." We had nowhere else to go. The admission hung between them, raw and unadorned, and Elias felt a stir of anger, not at them, but at the world that had driven them to his doorstep. He wanted to ask what kind of man they thought he was, a man who'd chosen silence over life, who'd let grief carve him hollow. Instead, he looked at Jonah, whose eyes held a defiance. That reminded Elias of himself at that age, before the world taught him loss. The boy's courage, small but fierce, was a rebuke to Elias's years of retreat. He gestured toward the house, his voice gruff. "Come inside. You can rest." The words felt foreign, like stones in his mouth, but once spoken, they carried a weight he couldn't take back. The women exchanged glances, a flicker of relief passing between them, and they moved toward the porch, their children trailing close. Lila's soft whimper broke the silence as Amelia adjusted her hold, and Elias noticed the girl's shoes, worn thin, her toes peeking through. The sight twisted something deep in his chest, a memory of Lily's laughter as she ran barefoot through the grass. Inside, the farmhouse was a time capsule, its air stale with disuse, the furniture sparse and coated in dust. Amelia settled Lila on the floor, where the child curled up, clutching her ribbon like a lifeline. Ruth guided Jonah to a wooden bench, her hand never leaving his, while Esther stood near the door, her bundle pressed tight against her chest, as if letting it go would unravel her entirely. Elias leaned against the wall, unwilling to sit, to make this moment feel permanent. The silence in the room was different now, no longer his own but shared, fragile, filled with the soft breathing of children and the rustle of worn fabric. Amelia's gaze swept the room, lingering on a faded quilt draped over a chair, its stitches uneven, the work of a child's hands. "Yours?" she asked, her tone gentle, probing. Elias's throat tightened, but he nodded, unable to speak of Lily's quilt, sewn under Clara's patient guidance. Ruth broke the tension, her voice practical. "We left at dawn yesterday, after the boarding house owner gave us an ultimatum. We couldn't stay, not with what he demanded." Her words were clipped, guarding details, but the anger in her eyes told. Elias enough men who preyed on desperation, who saw women and children as debts to be collected. He wanted to ask more, to understand the danger they'd fled, but Jonah's small voice cut through. "Mama, are we safe now?" The question was a blade, slicing through Elias's defenses, and Ruth's quick smile, meant to reassure, couldn't hide the uncertainty in her eyes. Elias felt the room shrink, the walls pressing in with the weight of their need. He moved to the kitchen, rummaging through a sparse pantry for anything to offer hard bread, a jar of preserves, a few shriveled apples. As he set the food on the table, Lila's eyes widened, her small hand reaching out before Amelia gently pulled it back, teaching restraint even in hunger. The gesture struck Elias like a blow, a reminder of Clara's quiet lessons to Lily, of a time when his home was filled with love instead of echoes. He cleared his throat. "Eat what you can. There's water in the pitcher." The women hesitated, pride warring with necessity, but the children's hunger won out, and they gathered around the table, their small hands tearing into the bread. Elias watched from the doorway, a stranger in his own home, as the sound of their quiet gratitude filled the space. Esther looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Mr. Hart. We'll be gone by morning, we promise." But Elias saw the fear in her eyes, the same fear he'd seen in Clara's during those final days, when hope was a luxury they couldn't afford. He wanted to tell them to leave, to keep his life uncluttered, but the sight of Jonah carefully breaking his bread to share with Lila stopped him. These weren't just strangers. They were a test, a chance to be more than the man who'd let grief define him. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the dusty windows, Elias realized that opening his door had let in more than 3 women and their children. It had let in the possibility of redemption, and that scared him more than any threat waiting beyond his gate. The farmhouse's dim interior seemed to soften as the last rays of sunlight filtered through grimy windows, casting a warm glow over the 3 women and their children gathered around Elias Hart's scarred table. Amelia cradled Lila, who nibbled on a piece of hard bread, her small face smudged with preserves, while Ruth kept a protective arm around Jonah, whose cautious glances at Elias betrayed a boy forced to grow up too fast. Esther, still clutching her bundle, sat rigidly, her eyes darting to the door as if expecting it to burst open. Elias leaned against the kitchen doorway, his arms crossed, watching the scene unfold like a man standing on the edge of a river, unsure whether to wade in or turn back. The air held a fragile truce, the silence broken only by the children's soft chewing and the creak of the bench. Amelia's gaze lingered on the quilt draped over a chair, its childish stitches a silent testament to a life Elias had left frozen. In time, she spoke first, her voice low. "This place feels like it's been waiting for something. Or someone." The words weren't an accusation, but they landed like one, stirring a flicker of guilt in Elias's chest. He shifted, unwilling to meet her eyes, and muttered, "It's just a house." But Ruth, ever practical, steered the conversation elsewhere. Her tone measured. "We didn't plan to burden you, Mr. Hart. We just needed to get far enough to breathe." Jonah looked up at her, his brow furrowed, and whispered, "Are they still looking for us, Mama?" The question hung heavy, and Ruth's quick squeeze of his shoulder couldn't mask the tension that rippled through the room. Elias felt a stir of curiosity, tempered by dread. He didn't want their story, didn't want to care. But the boy's fear was a mirror to his own past, to nights when he'd sat helpless by Lily's bedside, powerless against the fever. He cleared his throat. "Who's after you? You said the boarding house wasn't safe, but what's chasing you now?" The women exchanged glances, a silent debate passing between them. Esther spoke, her voice barely audible. "The owner, Mr. Voss. He doesn't let debts go unpaid. He sent a man after us, someone who knows these trails better than we do." Her fingers tightened on her bundle, and Elias noticed a faint tremble, the kind that comes from carrying fear too long. Amelia added, "We hid in a ditch when we saw his horse yesterday. He was asking questions at every farm, showing papers, saying we owe him." The word "owe" carried a venom that made Elias's jaw clench. Men like Voss, who turned desperation into chains, were no strangers to him. He'd seen their kind in town, years ago, when Clara begged for medicine and was turned away because their coin wasn't enough. Jonah's voice broke through again, small but clear. "I heard him say he'd take Leela if we didn't go back." The boy's eyes flicked to the toddler, who was now dozing against Amelia's chest, her ribbon tangled in her fingers. The image of a man threatening a child as leverage sparked a quiet rage in Elias, one he hadn't felt since he'd stood over Lily's grave, vowing never to let the world touch him again. He moved to the table, setting down a pitcher of water, the clink of glass loud in the stillness. "No one's taking anyone," he said, the words sharper than he intended. Ruth's eyes met his, searching, and she nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the promise he hadn't meant to make. Lila stirred. her eyelids fluttering, and reached for the quilt, her tiny hand brushing its edge. Amelia hesitated, then asked, "May she touch it?" Elias stiffened, the quilt a relic of Lily's hands, but the child's innocent curiosity softened something in him. He nodded, and Lila's fingers traced the stitches, her touch gentle, as if sensing its weight. The moment felt like a bridge, fragile but real, between Elias's past and the present unfolding before him. Esther relaxed slightly, her bundle loosening in her grip, revealing a small embroidered cloth, a child's dress. Perhaps, or a keepsake from a life left behind. "We don't have much," she said, "but we'll work to repay you. We're not here to take." Elias waved her off, uncomfortable with gratitude, but Amelia's quiet smile held a warmth that unnerved him. She stood, easing Lila to the floor, and began, clearing the table, her movements efficient, as if claiming a small piece of the space. Ruth joined her, guiding Jonah to help, and the boy's reluctant obedience reminded Elias of his own childhood, of chores done under Clara's watchful eye. The ordinary act of cleaning felt extraordinary in the house's long, quiet rooms, a sign of life where only echoes had lingered. Elias stepped outside to the porch, needing air, the valley stretching dark and vast before him. The stars were emerging, sharp against the sky, and he thought of Clara's voice, reading to Lily under these same stars. The women's presence was a disruption, yes, but also a tether, pulling him back to a world he'd forsaken. He heard soft footsteps behind him, Amelia, standing at the threshold. "We'll leave at first light," she said, but her tone held a question, a hope. Elias didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the trail disappeared into shadow. He didn't know if he could let them stay, but he knew he couldn't send them back to whatever hunted them. The night settled over Elias' hearts. Farmhouse like a heavy cloak, the air inside thick with the scent of dust and the faint sweetness of the preserves the children had eaten. Amelia, Ruth, and Esther sat quietly, their children asleep on makeshift pallets of blankets, Lila's soft snores mingling with the creak of the old floorboards. Elias stood by the window, his silhouette rigid against the starlit glass, his rifle propped nearby, not aimed but ready. The women's story of flight from the boarding house had stirred a restless energy in him, a mix of protectiveness and dread that made the silence feel alive, charged with the threat of what might come. He'd promised no one would take the children, words that had slipped out unbidden, binding him to these strangers in a way he hadn't intended. Outside, the valley was still, but the quiet felt deceptive, like the calm before a storm. Jonah, curled near Ruth, stirred in his sleep, murmuring something about horses, and Elias's grip tightened on the window frame, his eyes scanning the dark trail. The women had spoken of a man tracking them, sent by the boarding house owner, Voss, and the thought of a predator circling closer set his nerves on edge. Amelia rose, moving to check on Lila, her movements careful, as if not to disturb the fragile peace. She glanced at Elias, her voice low. "You don't have to do this, Mr. Hart. We can leave now, spare you the trouble." Her offer was sincere, but her eyes betrayed her fear of the road ahead, of the man who'd passed them in the dusk, asking questions at every farm. Elias shook his head, his voice rough. "You're here now. No sense running in the dark." The words were practical, but they carried a weight he felt in his bones, a commitment he wasn't sure he could keep. Before he could say more, the distant thud of hoofbeats broke the night, fast and deliberate, coming from the trail. Esther froze, her bundle slipping to the floor, while Ruth pulled Jonah closer, waking him. The boy's eyes widened, searching the shadows, and Elias felt a surge of protectiveness, sharp and unfamiliar, like a blade long sheathed. He grabbed his rifle, stepping to the door, his voice low. "Stay back. Keep the children quiet." Amelia nodded, herding Lila and Jonah to the fire corner, while Esther whispered soothing words to her own daughter, who'd begun to whimper. Elias eased the door open, the night air cool against his face, and saw two figures dismount at the gate, their shapes stark against the moonlight. One was lean, predatory, his movements sharp as a blade Caleb Voss, the man they'd fled. The other, heavier, wore a badge that glinted faintly, Sheriff Jonah Tate, a name Elias knew from years ago, a man whose justice came with a price. Voss called out, his voice oily with confidence. "Hart, We know you've got them. Hand over the women, and we walk away clean." Elias stepped onto the porch, rifle cradled, his stance unyielding. "You're on my land uninvited. State your business and go." Tate smirked, resting a hand on his holster. They're fugitives, Hart. Stole from Voss's establishment, broke contracts. Law's on our side. The lie was brazen, and Elias's blood heated, remembering men like Tate who turned a blind eye when Clara begged for help, when Lily's life hung in the balance. Amelia's voice came from behind, steady but defiant. "We stole nothing but our freedom, and you know it." She stepped onto the porch, Ruth and Esther behind her, their children huddled in the doorway. Jonah, clutching Ruth's skirt, glared at Voss, his small frame trembling with courage. Voss's eyes narrowed. "You sign papers, all of you. You owe me 6 months, and I'll have it one way or another." Elias raised his rifle slightly, his voice cold. "You'll have nothing but trouble if you don't ride out now." The standoff stretched taut, the night air crackling with tension. Tate tried to play peacemaker, his tone false. "Let's keep this civil, Hart. Just hand them over, and no one gets hurt." But Elias saw the glint in Voss's hand, a pistol half drawn, and his heart pounded with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. These women, standing tall despite their fear, weren't just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for their children, for a chance at a life free of chains. Jonah's small voice broke the silence. "You can't take my mama." The words were a spark, igniting something fierce in Elias, a resolve to protect what he'd once failed to save. He leveled his rifle at Voss, his voice steady. "Last chance. Leave or you won't." The men hesitated, calculating, but the sound of hoofbeats grew louder, signaling more riders approaching, and Elias knew the next moments would decide everything. The hoofbeats grew louder, a thunderous pulse against the night, as Elias Hart stood firm on his porch, rifle trained on Caleb Voss and Sheriff Jonah Tate. Amelia, Ruth, and Esther formed a defiant line beside him, their children huddled in the doorway, Jonah's small hand gripping Leila's tightly. The moonlight cast stark shadows, sharpening the menace in Voss's eyes as he sneered. "You're outmatched, Hart. Those women belong to me." Elias's grip tightened, his voice low. They belonged to no one. The approaching riders crested the hill. 5 men led by Nathan Cole, a grizzled rancher whose name carried weight in the valley. His presence shifted the air, his sharp gaze taking in the scene. Elias's steady aim, the women's unyielding stance, the children's frightened faces. Dismounting, Nathan's voice cut through the tension. "Sheriff Tate, what's a lawman doing backing a vulture like Voss?" Tate's confidence wavered, his hand hovering near his holster, but he answered, enforcing contracts. These women owed debts. Nathan's eyes narrowed, landing on Voss. "Debts? Or are you selling lives to line your pockets?" The accusation hung heavy, and Elias felt a spark of hope. Nathan wasn't just a bystander. He was a force, respected and incorruptible. Ruth stepped forward, her voice fierce. "We sign nothing but survival. Under threats, no one should endure." Jonah, her son, added, his voice small but clear, "You scared my mama. You don't get to take her." The boy's courage, raw and uncheckable, struck Elias like a memory of Lily's defiance, her tiny hand clutching his during the fever's worst nights. Voss's patience snapped, his pistol swinging toward Jonah. "Enough talk. The boy comes with U.S. or no one leaves." Amelia moved instantly, placing herself between Voss and the child, her voice steady. "Take me instead. Leave them be." Esther and Ruth joined her, a wall of maternal resolve, their offer a sacrifice that pierced Elias's heart. He saw Clara in their stance, her willingness to give everything for Lily, and something inside him broke free, a resolve he buried under years of grief. "No one's going," he said, stepping down from the porch, rifle still raised. "You want them, you'll have to go through me." Nathan's men fanned out, their weapons drawn, and the balance tipped. Voss's bravado faltered, his eyes darting between Elias and Nathan's crew. Tate, sensing the shift, tried to backpedal. "Let's not escalate, Hart. We can settle this." But Nathan's rifle barked, the shot splintering the ground near Voss's feet, sending him staggering. Threatening children crosses a line. Nathan growled, working the bolt. Get out, both of you. Tate's face paled, his authority crumbling under the weight of honest men. Elias felt the past and present collide. Clara and Lily's loss had left him powerless once. But now, with these women and children depending on him, he was anything but. Amelia's hand brushed his arm, a silent thank you, and he saw in her eyes a strength that mirrored his own reawakening. Voss, clutching his side, spat curses but retreated, helped by Tate, who avoided Nathan's gaze. As their horses disappeared into the night, the valley exhaled, the threat dissolving into the dark. Elias lowered his rifle, his hands trembling, not from fear, but from the realization that he'd chosen to fight, to protect, to be the man he'd forgotten. Nathan clapped his shoulder. You did right, Hart. The valley's with you. The women gathered their children, Lila clinging to Amelia, Jonah standing tall beside Ruth. Elias looked at them, their faces lit by the faint glow from the farmhouse, and felt the weight of his solitude lift, replaced by a purpose he hadn't known he could reclaim. The dawn broke gently over Elias Hart's farm, painting the valley in hues of gold and soft pink, as if the world itself was exhaling after the night's tension. Inside the farmhouse, the air felt lighter, filled with the soft rustle of blankets, and the quiet breathing of sleeping children. Amelia, Ruth, and Esther sat on the porch, watching Lila and Jonah chase each other around a gnarled oak, their laughter a melody that seemed to wake the long silent land. Elias stood in the doorway, his hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee, the warmth grounding him as he took in the scene. The women's faces, once taut with fear, now held a cautious hope, their eyes reflecting the sunrise. He'd offered them a place to stay, words spoken in the heat of the standoff, but met with a conviction that surprised him. This place could use you, he'd said, and now, watching Lila clutch a wooden bird he'd carved for her, a twin to one he'd made for Lily years ago, he felt the truth of it. Amelia approached, her steps quiet, her voice soft. We can't repay you for what you did, standing up to Voss and Tate like that. Elias shook his head, looking past her to the horizon. You don't owe me. I needed this as much as you. The admission felt raw, like opening a wound to let it heal. Ruth joined them, Jonah trailing behind, his small hand slipping into hers. We'll work, she said firmly, to make this place home, if you'll have us. Esther nodded, her bundle now unpacked, revealing a small sewing kit she'd already used to mend Lila's dress. Elias saw in their resolve a mirror of Clara's strength, her ability to build a life from scraps of hope. The valley, once his prison, now stretched before him like a canvas, ready for new colors. He stepped off the porch, kneeling to hand. Lila another carved bird, her delighted giggle echoing in his chest. It's yours, he said, his voice catching as he thought of Lily, of how she'd loved watching birds flit through the grass. Amelia smiled, her eyes glistening. You've given. Yours more than shelter, Mr. Hart. You've given us a chance. Over the weeks, the farm transformed. Ruth taught the children under the oak, her lessons filled with stories of resilience. Esther's garden bloomed with wildflowers, a patch of color against the dusty earth. Amelia's needle flew, stitching clothes for the valley's families, her earnings piling into a jar for their future. Elias found himself joining them, teaching Jonah to mend fences, his gruff instructions softening with the boy's eager questions. The farmhouse, once a tomb, rang with voices, with the clatter of dishes, with life. One evening, as the sun dipped, lo, Elias sat on the porch, the quilt Lily had sewn draped over his shoulders. The children played nearby, their laughter weaving into the dusk, and he felt Clara's presence, not as a ghost, but as a warmth, a reminder that love endures through choices made for others. Amelia sat beside him, her hands still, her voice steady. This place feels like home now, because of you. Elias looked at her, then at the children, and felt the ache of his loss's ease, not gone, but softened by the new life growing around him. The valley glowed under the fading light, and for the first time in a decade, Elias Hart wasn't afraid of the dark. He'd found courage not in fighting alone, but in letting others in choosing to protect, to love, to live again. The farm, once a refuge for his grief, was now a haven for second chances, its heart beating in the laughter of children and the quiet strength of those who'd chosen to stay.